Okay, that's part of the Age of Jackson. What we're going to look at now is we're going to look at our Western treks, the Oregon land fever, right? People are heading west. I don't know how many of you ever played Oregon Trail, but my wife and I used to play Oregon Trail all the time. How many times did you win?
Oh, maybe once.
Maybe
but
once.
Most of the time
Did you guys play the retro Oregon Trail? I'm making my kids watch my videos because it's no fun to just talk to a camera. Did you ever play Oregon Trail? How many times did you win all the time? You didn't take a doctor, did you? And you need an extra anchor, an extra axle, and you got to have somebody who can hunt, or else you're not going to die. You got to have a doctor, or else you all die of typhoid. So, but the Oregon Trail, the actual Oregon Trail, this is what you would take. This is what you would go. This is called a Conestoga wagon. Now, I'm going to ask one of my kids, what does that look like? A what? And what's shaped like a banana?
Covered wagon.
A boat.
A boat. You know why it looks like a boat? Because this is what you would call an all-terrain vehicle. This is an all-terrain vehicle. It's got high axles so you can go over big rocks. And if you have to, you can get this thing in a river and you can float it across a river if you have to, okay? This is how they traveled west because they had no idea what they were running into. They were headed out west, and most were headed to Oregon. Okay? I've got a map here that shows sort of the treks to the trail. Let's see, I guess this would be by 1846. No. By about 1846. No, 1836. This is the United States. All the peak territory is the United States. Oregon territory, all of this, is disputed territory between the United States and Great Britain. Okay? So people from the east are headed up the Oregon Trail, right? They follow the trail from Independence, Missouri, and then they get here, they'll either go to the California Trail, heading to San Francisco, or they'll head to Oregon City on the Oregon Trail. Of course, there is also the Santa Fe Trail that leaves, that comes down to Santa Fe, what we think of Santa Fe, New Mexico. This is what the country looks like, and these folks are heading west. Okay? Now, during this time period, one of the most important developments, technological developments in America's history is going to take place. It's the advent of the railroad. We've already seen in earlier videos a introduction to railroads, to the system, just very short, small railroads. The B&O railroads start out with 13 miles and eventually gets 3,000 miles. But what you've got going on here, this is America's first legitimate industry, okay? The railroad is going to be so vast and so large, it's going to impact everything we do. I've used this example before for students before, and I don't know if everybody actually what they think about it, but it's like this. Back in 1988, my wife and I got married. And the year after we got married, we bought our first computer. Remember our first computer? We went to Sears and we bought a Sears computer, and it was something. It was a good computer. It was called an 8088, and it had two 5 1/4-inch floppy drives. I even bought a modem that I could plug into the phone. I could dial a number because we had that kind of phone, and when the bulletin board went beep beep, I would put it on the cradle, and that was our computer. 2 years after we were married, all of it was obsolete. Everything changed. Everything changed. Pardon? Because it almost cost $2,000. It was $1,600. And it was fast. It was a blazing 4.77 megahertz. That's how fast it was, 4.77 megahertz. But it had a turbo button. When you'd hit the turbo button, it would go all the way up to 7 megahertz. Phew, that was fast. 2 years later, something comes on the scene called the Internet. How many of you have heard of the Internet? Have you heard of the Internet? The Internet changes everything. 15 years ago, when I would stand in front of a class, I would ask the class, how many of you have ever bought something off the Internet? And I would get 4 or 5 out of 20 students to raise their hand. 4 or 5 out of 20 students. Now, I have to ask, how many of you have never ordered anything off the Internet? And you know how many students raise their hand? None. None. Because that's how we do business now. That's how, in the old days, if you were going on a trip, you would call a travel agent, somebody who could make phone calls and get you the best deals on your hotels and your airline tickets and your train tickets and all the tickets you needed. Right? Now, you go to one of the internet sites, Trivago or, Kayak or any, and it searches the internet for you to find, quote unquote, the best prices. Everything changed. There was a little tiny store. I used to love getting on this brand new internet because I like books. And there was this little tiny website that expressed itself as being the world's largest bookstore. It was a little tiny company called, what was the name of that company? Oh, that's right, Amazon. Amazon used to sell books, and that's all they sold. It was the world's largest bookstore. You know what you can buy on Amazon now? Everything. You can buy a coffin on Amazon. Of course, you can buy a coffin on Walmart. They won't send it to your house. They'll send it to the funeral parlor where you're going to be buried. But see, the kind of change that happened between 1988 and 1992, the kind of change that took place then is what's taken place here in the West with the advent of the railroad. The railroad is going to do so many things to change the way that America, it leads us into the Industrial Revolution. Unfortunately, before we get there, we smack dab in the middle of the Civil War. Now, the railroad, it's the most advanced development in the age. Once steam technology starts to become safer, high-pressure steam engines operating at 150 psi, huge locomotives. See where I said dozens of cars? It should say hundreds of cars. Huge locomotives pulling hundreds of cars. Each car's carrying hundreds of tons of cargo. Miles of iron track. Massive bridge works, because basically if you go into hilly country like this area here, you can't have your train going up a hill and then down a hill, then up a hill, then down a hill. What you would do is you would build a bridge work across the tops of the hills so that the train would only have to gradually go uphill rather than up and down the hills. I've gotten a nice example of a bridge work here for you. And very, very complex organizational structures. Some of the, well, for example, when you build these railroad tracks, you don't build an eastbound track and then a westbound track. You build a track. And so you have to have complex structures. That's why in all the movies you've got the conductor standing there with his watch. And when it says 11:03, he says, all aboard. And everybody gets on the train because the train has to leave. If the freight train doesn't leave, then it's going to run smack into the express train that's coming up the track. It has to leave on time so it can get on the side track while the express train uses that track. So these very complex organizational structures are going to have to be instituted so that we can keep from having too many train wrecks. We still have train wrecks, but just not as many. Now, when the canals and rivers are frozen in the winters, the trains can keep on moving. The trains can keep going. When floodwaters in the spring make the rivers too dangerous to navigate, trains can keep on going. Trains can go anywhere. When summer droughts dry up the rivers, the trains keep on going. When sailing ships can't go anywhere because of bad weather, these trains can keep moving. The railroads make it possible for commerce to continue in almost any kind of conditions. It also provides an opportunity for cities that are not close to a major waterway to become prosperous and to engage in trade with the rest of the world, because these railroads are going to connect them with all of the other cities, just the way in the old days rivers connected large city to large city. Okay, and by the 1850s, these things are averaging blinding speeds, 20 miles an hour by 1850. Amazing speeds. Now, I've got a picture, an example of what's a bridge work. This is a picture from my wife and our book on Old Butler. This isn't a train from back in the 1850s. Matter of fact, this small private railroad is part of the Whiting Lumber Company. We took this picture a number of years ago. Again, when we found this in their archives of the museum, and so we made sure we put it in our book. It's amazing resolution on this thing. If you download this PowerPoint to your computer, you can look at this picture. You can actually zoom in. We can zoom in on the original negative. We can zoom in so close on this guy standing here on the front, we can actually see who he is. Matter of fact, we had a lady at the Butler Museum tell us that her grandfather used to work at the Whiting Lumber Company, and we showed her this picture, and she said she thinks that's her grandfather standing on the front because he was a foreman of one of the logging crews. Okay, this private railroad is giving us an example of what the bridge works of the 1850s looked like. It's hard to see it here on the video, but it looks like all the scrap lumber, all the scrap little trees that won't fit into the sawmill were sort of tied together to create this massive bridge. See, the area around Old Butler is very hilly, lots and lots of hills and valleys. And so the way that they would make this railroad useful is they would just bridge from hilltop to hilltop, until it got down to the sawmill, where they would take all this virgin timber from way up on top of the mountain and bring it down to the sawmill. Now, I use this picture to show you the bridge work, because these are the kinds of things that are popping up all over the place. If you've ever seen the old cowboy movie, Two Mules for Sister Sarah, a Clint Eastwood film, Clint Eastwood has to blow up a bridge that looks remarkably like this one. So it gives you sort of this picture of what's going on. Now, I've already mentioned a couple times about the difference between the North and the South, how the North develops, how the South develops. All of the green states here are slave states, and all the yellow states are the free states. Now, look at the difference between the rail lines in the South and the rail lines in the North. The North is a virtual patchwork of these rail lines. The North is these railroad tracks are all over the place. Now, under normal circumstances, the South is not interested in industrializing or mechanizing. However, the railroad provides them with such a benefit of hauling thousands of tons of cotton. They can't ignore the technology. So even though they resist all other progressive ideals, the South is going to allow these railroads to be installed to connect the inner cities with the port cities. That's what they do. You don't have this patchwork connecting the large cities on the interior like you have up here in the North. You have inner cities, especially around Chattanooga. This is one of the, and Atlanta and Augusta. These are two of the big centralizing points on the territory. When the railroad comes into play, even the South can't ignore the railroad because it's going to be such a benefit to their lives basically in every way. Now, other industries that are going to benefit from the advent of the railroad, iron production is going to grow 5 times faster because of the railroad. Coal production is going to more than double. And then a new fledgling industry, probably kind of a fad. It may not even catch on. This new thing called the telegraph will come on the scene during this time period. In 1844, from Washington to Baltimore, the first message will be sent from Washington to Baltimore. By 1861, 50,000 miles of wire are going to stretch across the country all the way to the Pacific. What the telegraph does for the railroad industry is it makes it safer. It makes rail travel safer and better. Because now, if a train has a problem and it can't make it off the track in time, they can send a telegram forward to stop the express from coming until they can get the train cleared from the track. So it's going to reduce the number of train wrecks exponentially as this thing goes. And again, it is one of the first, it's one of the next steps towards what happens in the later semester with the advent of the telephone. Railroads and government, all these railroads are privately owned. All these railroads are privately owned. Up until 1850, the federal government had granted about 7 million acres of land to turnpikes, highways, canals, things that were sort of that kind of like this infrastructure building. Okay, so up to 1850, from 1776 until 1850, 7 million acres of land have been given over to make these kinds of projects. In 1850, Stephen A. Douglas, the senator from Illinois, is going to propose a huge land grant to the railroads to help them recoup the cost of building their rail lines. Okay? This land grant is going to give, for every mile of track that's laid, it will give them 6 square miles of land, 3 miles on either side of the track, that the railroads can do with what they want. What they normally do is they sell this land to individuals who want to build towns. Because if you want to build a town, if you promise to have a fresh source of water and a fresh source of fuel, the railroad will put a depot in your town. And if your town has a depot, then you are connected with the rest of the world. And so the railroad's able to sell this land. In 10 years, the railroads will be granted more than 20 million acres of land because they're going to build so much track around all over the northern part of the country. And they're going to get this enormous land grant. Now, critics of Douglas's plan ask, are these railroads still privately owned? And the answer, of course, is yes. Then the critics say, well, then are we going to be able to use the railroads for free? And the answer is resoundingly, well, no. Then their question becomes, then why are we giving them land to recoup their costs when they're going to just make enough in profit to pay for the costs? This is a big deal. But these individuals in this time period are looking for methods. They're looking for methods, to strengthen their support. Stephen Douglas, who is the representative from Illinois, the Democrat from Illinois, is actually going to, when he makes up this proposal, most people believe his plan is to hope that when these railroads start their transcontinental railroad all the way to Oregon, it will make its way through Chicago. And it'll go east from Chicago, connecting directly Chicago with New York and Oregon. So most people believe that he's giving this sweet deal to the railroads so that eventually the railroads will owe him enough that they have to come back and assist him. Now, they serve cities and farms. They serve everybody. freight and passengers. They carry everything. Older forms of transportation are still going to be used, especially in the South. Okay? When the Postal Service, the railroads will carry mail to the major cities, and then stagecoaches and even sometimes the Pony Express will pick up the mail to deliver it to the far-flung smaller areas where there are no railroads built. So these older forms of transportation will still be used, but at this point, these older forms of transportation are going to start to be diminished because of how influential and necessary the railroads are. Okay, we're going to stop this lecture here, and then we're going to see one more, which we're going to talk about the difference between the War for Texas Independence and the Mexican-American War, and we'll talk a little bit about the Gold Rush in 1849, and then I think we'll be done with this whole section, and you can take your joyous celebration.